Okay, we're live. Okay. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Josh Peck. I've talked to him before, but we're going to talk today about a book he published September 15th, 2021. Title of that book is The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, 2025 and the Final Age of Man. And right now on Amazon, it has 78 five-star reviews. It's a superbly well-researched, really interesting book. And I'm really glad he wrote it because I learned a lot reading through it. This is not his first book. Our last conversation was about a documentary that he made about sex trafficking. Title of that is Silent Cry, The Darker Side of Trafficking. And you can listen to that on my podcast if you want to look back. That was from October 2020. On Amazon, it has 298 five-star reviews. So that was very well received as well. And it's an excellent documentary. Also, this is not his first book. He's written many books, starting back in 2013. 4 Degrees of Baptism, also 2013, Spiritual Warfare Against the Satanic Government. And then also in 2013, Sorting Out the Resurrection and Ascensions of Christ. And then 2014, Disclosure. Also, Quantum Creation, Does the Supernatural Lurk in the Fourth Dimension? 2014. Cherubim Chariots, Exploring the Extra-Dimensional Hypothesis, 2015. And then with Tom Horn, he wrote Abaddon Ascending, The Ancient Conspiracy at the Center of CERN's Most Secretive Mission, from 2017. And then in 2020, Afterlife, Near-Death Experiences, Neuroscience, Quantum Physics, and the Increasing Evidence for Life After Death. And he is the host of the Sharpening Report, which can be found on the Daily Renegade. So if you go to your podcast stuff or iTunes, look up the Daily Renegade and you'll see the Sharpening Report on there. And some other shows as well. So a lot of Christian biblical analysis and things like that. Also, his website is dailyrenegade.com. But again, we're going to talk about this book he just published titled The Lost Prophecies of Qumran. So, Josh Peck, welcome back to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, likewise, man. It's always great to talk with you. For people who may not have heard our last interview, can you talk about, you have just a lot of books and a documentary. Can you talk about some of your work and then what led you to write The Lost Prophecies of Qumran?
Yeah. So I started in full-time ministry in about 2012, and like you mentioned, I wrote some back then. I was still trying to get used to writing, so I wrote some really short, like 50-page books. That was the first few that you mentioned, and then I started getting into more full books and stuff. Tom Horn got a hold of some of my work from Dr. Michael Lake, actually passed it along, so shout out to him. Big thanks to Dr. Lake. He's a big reason I'm where I am now, working with Skywatch. But Tom liked it, so he invited me out for an interview when Skywatch was just starting. I was one of the first interviews, and that's when my wife and I got to meet the team. And so a little while after that, Tom offered us jobs, and we moved from Michigan to Missouri, and I've been at Skywatch ever since. So yeah, the books, everything from Abaddon Ascending and forward is all Defender books. The ones before that were like self-published stuff when I was first starting out.
Gotcha.
And then what led me to write this book, actually a really good friend of mine, Dr. Ken Johnson, he's been doing work with the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they might relate with the Bible. He's been doing that for years, and it's always been kind of an interest of mine, at least. But after the Silent Cry documentary came out, I was trying to figure out what the next thing was going to be. And the way that it's been lately is, the way I interpret it is God just puts an interest in me. And then for some reason, I get really into that one topic until I make a movie or write a book. And then I'm still interested in it, but it's not as intense. It goes on to the next thing. So I'm still very much in the Dead Sea Scroll. That's what led to that book. And I'm still researching the Dead Sea Scrolls. I might do something with the Millennial Temple next. We'll have to see, though.
Right. So for people who don't or have not heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls or Qumran, can you kind of give a historical background of its location and how it was found and how these scrolls came to our present attention or interest?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in a place called Qumran in Israel. They were found in the 40s and 50s, and researchers have been and translators have been looking into these ever since. But Basically, this is the temple library from a Jewish group called the Essenes. They were formed around the same time as the Pharisees and Sadducees that we're familiar with from the Gospels. But the Essenes believed that the Pharisees and Sadducees had actually become corrupt, so they formed a settlement in Qumran. And that's where they wrote and they kept the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were still around during the time of Christ. So when we get to the Gospels and when we're in that time period, the Essenes are already established and in Qumran. Pharisees and Sadducees are already at the temple, and Israel is the way that it is in the Gospels. So we have this time period between the close of the Old Testament and the open of the New Testament. And we notice that Israel is very different in the two testaments. There's actually a period of about 400 years. It's called the 400 silent years. But it's basically the time between the Old and New Testament, and much of that time period is a mystery, but we can piece some things together, and that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls fit in. So the Dead Sea Scrolls came into existence around this time, within this 400 silent years. So we can use them to tell us what happened in between those testaments. Now, I don't consider the Dead Sea Scrolls as scripture. Well, I mean, they had copies of all the biblical books, except one or two of them. But as far as the extra biblical stuff, I don't consider that scripture, but it's good for history. I consider it accurate. Now, before the Dead Sea Scrolls, we only had some scattered parts of the Talmud, the 4 books of Maccabees and Josephus to tell us what happened between the testaments. But the Dead Sea Scrolls actually has a lot more to say about that time period, and it all has to do with the Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees, how everybody came to be, and how the Dead Sea Scrolls came to be in Qumran. So after the time of Christ, when the temple was destroyed, it's probably about there when this happened, the Essenes mysteriously disappeared, and we can talk about that too if you like later. But they mysteriously disappeared, and they left behind their whole temple library. So when people talk about, like in Cave 11, they found this or that scroll, that's what they're talking about, these Dead Sea Scrolls. There were 11 caves, possibly 12. There might be another one. But there were at least 11 caves, and they all had these scrolls that were decently preserved for being 2,000 years old, but as well preserved as they were still fragmented. There's still a bunch of pieces we don't have. So what we have right now is just really fragmented and incomplete, but it does give enough information about the Essenes, kind of what their establishment was like, and a little bit more in the time just before the time of Christ. So it's really interesting.
Right. So, I mean, it was found, I think, by a shepherd boy throwing rocks, heard some ceramics or something, and went in. And so these, and like you said, it's the complete corpus of what we know as our standard Bible,
yes,
with additional files. So there's other things that are in there. And you actually mentioned, Dr. Ken Johnson, there's a copper scroll in there as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So this was one of the weirder things. I didn't write too much about it in my book. I did a section of a chapter on it because you can't really talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls without at least mentioning the copper scroll. But there is a really excellent full book, if people are interested in this, by Shelley Neese and Jim Barfield, called The Copper Scroll Project. And there's a ton of information there about it. But basically, when they were finding all these scrolls, and most of them are just parchment, normally what you would expect, but there was one that was kind of hidden, and it's on a little piece of copper, and it was actually rolled up too. So we had to use modern technology to actually be able to unroll this thing to read it. But it's on copper, and it looks like basically a list of treasures and like where to find them and things. So the Copper Scroll Project, they are trying to get out there and try to find these artifacts that's listed in this copper scroll, but due to political situation and stuff, they're having a hard time actually being able to excavate anything there. But so if people want more information on that, they should look up the Copper Scroll Project. But I do have an interview in the Lost Prophecies of Qumran with Jim Barfield of the Copper Scroll Project, and that's included in there as well. So people can...
Fascinating. So it's almost like a treasure map of all of this stuff. And you mentioned political. These scrolls do have a lot of politicization and things like that associated with where they are and their interpretation and meaning, right?
Oh, big time. Yeah. Well, I mean, for one thing, it's proof. It's further proof that the Jewish people have right to that land because the Dead Sea Scrolls are there. So just politically, that alone is an issue. So it makes it harder for any excavations to be done there. But also just within academia or just within Christianity, it seems like a lot of people have trouble knowing what to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they fit. With probably like our audiences, the biggest question I get asked about this is, should these be in the Bible? Because among the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of Enoch is quoted in the Bible in a couple of places. So, I get asked that, should Enoch be in the Bible? And I say no, because I think that's the safe answer. You can read Enoch if you want. But
if you're Ethiopian, it's in your Bible.
Ethiopians have it. Now, if you read the Ethiopian, though, some of the numbers, some of the dates, like the year dates, are going to be wrong. There's something about, and Jubilees is like that too. There's something about translating from Hebrew to, maybe Greek or whatever, but from Hebrew to something to Ethiopian Ge'ez, that it messes with the numbers, and sometimes the numbers don't come out right. So when you're reading Ethiopian stuff, just keep in mind the numbers might not be exact, but there are it is, besides that, it's very, very close. So we have enough in the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Book of Enoch to know that the Ethiopian one is a very accurate translation, except the numbers. So that's really cool. But yeah, as far as should it be in the Bible, I think it's really good history. And I think it's good to see kind of what the culture around the Second Temple period or the intertestamental period, how the Essenes thought about things, and But as far as should it be in our Bibles, I don't think so. There's so many Dead Sea Scrolls. I have books and books and books. If you included them in the Bible, no one would read the Bible. It'd be way too big. So just practically speaking, but even on the question of inspiration, I do believe these had a purpose for a time, and we don't fully know what that purpose was or is. It definitely led to the spread of Christianity, actually, which is really cool, and that's a cool story with the Essenes. But they served a purpose for a time, and I think we can learn from them historically. But I don't believe that God intends us to lift these above or to the level of Scripture. At the same time, I don't, and I want to mention this too, I do not believe there's any indication whatsoever that God wants us to like convert to the Essene religion or anything, because there are some people that it's like, well, the Pharisees and Sadducees had a bunch of problems, but it really seems like the Essenes had it together. So wouldn't that be the one? And yes, they did have it together. They actually predicted what the Messiah would be, who the Messiah would be, what the attributes would be, that this wasn't what the Pharisees thought, some military leader, and then there would be a second Messiah later, that this was one Messiah in two different appearances, his first coming, his second coming, that he would be a God in the flesh, that he would die for sins. They even got the date of when he would be put to death. So we're always told nobody in Israel knew when Jesus came that he would be how he was, but the Essenes knew. So yeah, they did have it together, but we have to remember they were still pre-Jesus. They weren't perfect, and they still had some stuff they needed to get corrected too. They were not nearly anywhere close to what the Pharisees and Sadducees were, but they needed to learn some lessons about love and things like that. So they weren't perfect, but they were the closest at that time, and they were the most easily converted. Well, I should say they were the easiest to follow Jesus when Jesus came. Yeah.
Right. And for people who don't know, on a map, Qumran is about 5 miles directly east from Jerusalem. Yeah. So for today's time, not that far, but maybe back then it was a decent journey, half a day journey or quarter day journey. So it's somewhere out there and overlooking the Dead Sea. But you go into depth about kind of the differences between the Pharisees, the Sadducees, Zadok, and maybe you could do a little bit of background, and it would, and the historicity of the Essenes, like we know from Pliny, and you mentioned them about and Philo. Maybe you could do a little bit of background about these religious groups where Christ was born into.
Yeah, so basically you had these three different sects, and they all had different ideas, mainly about everything. But at that time, the focus was mainly on the Messiah. So the Pharisees had this idea that there would be two messiahs. There would be the first one that would be some kind of military leader, and then that military messiah would give power to the Pharisees or something, help them win a war and give power over back to the Pharisees. Then a second one would come later, or he would die in battle or something. There was something like that. And then a second messiah would come later to fulfill the rest. Because, when you just read the Old Testament and you look at the Messiah prophecies, you could see why somebody would think these were two different people. Even though it says he, it doesn't say, they or anything. But you could see how somebody could make the mistake that these are two people. You have the suffering servant, and you also have the righteous king. So they thought it was two different messiahs. Now the Essenes, we can pretty much skip past the Sadducees. They didn't really believe in anything. They kind of had the belief of, whatever the government says, there's no afterlife. So whatever the government says, do that and live life as good as you can while you're here, as easy as you can. Go with the government, do what the government says. What's the point of fighting back? The Pharisees were not like that. Sadducees were, and it was because they didn't really believe in like angels, or they had lost a lot of their beliefs. Now, and then you got the Essenes. Now the Essenes believed in one Messiah, two different comings, which is interesting because that's a very Christian belief. And in many ways, these really were like the pre-Christians. So actually, there's a really good example of this. When John is in jail, John the Baptist, when he's in jail, he asks the apostles to ask Jesus if it is his time to bring in the kingdom, or if he should look for another. Now, what he's really asking there, it's not that, I'm in jail and now I don't know if Jesus is the Messiah. I'm losing my faith a little bit, or I'm questioning it. That's kind of how we're taught. That's not really what's going on. What's happening is, what John is asking, is there one Messiah or two? Are you the one Messiah that fulfills all of these, like the Essenes say? And by the way, there's really good reason to believe that John the Baptist was an Essene, and I can get into that a little bit later. Okay. But is it that, or should we look for another? Is there another that's going to fulfill all the kingdom things? So really what he's asking is, which interpretation is right, the Essenes or the Pharisees? He wasn't questioning his faith. He just wanted to make sure he was in the right camp. He was already following Jesus and was going to follow Jesus wherever. But he was just wondering. So when Jesus answered, Jesus gave the apostles a list of things that the Messiah is prophesied to do. And then he says, and go tell him that you have seen these things. Well, in that list is raising the dead. Yet that prophecy is not found anywhere in the Old Testament. There's nowhere in the Old Testament that says when the Messiah comes, he's supposed to be raising the dead. But we do find that in the Dead Sea Scroll. So we have at least one instance where Jesus specifically quoted a Dead Sea Scroll. And when you look at that Dead Sea Scroll, all 6 of those things are there. So that's really interesting. What Jesus was saying was, look, you guys got it right. You're the Essenes. You got the Dead Sea Scrolls. You got it right. And that Dead Sea Scroll, if people want to look it up, it's called the Messianic Apocalypse. It's really interesting, but it lists things that the Messiah is supposed to do. And so it's really cool stuff. Do you want to hear about how John the Baptist might be in a scene?
Absolutely.
All right, so this is really cool, and I love talking about this because he's one of the weirdest characters in the Gospels. And when we don't know the context of the Essenes, that's why we think he's so weird. He was actually, the Essenes themselves were weird in their time, but in a good way. So, but there's several reasons to think that John the Baptist actually had a connection with the Essenes. First, the Essenes believed that they were going to fulfill Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, about the voice crying in the wilderness to prepare the way of the Lord. That is all over in their documents when they talk about their own sect and like how their community works. Community Rule and Damascus document are 2 good ones if people want to look that up. But they talk about how they left because they felt they were supposed to fulfill this prophecy in Qumran somewhere. Well, and that was a big part why they went out to Qumran in the first place. But we find out John was a fulfillment of that prophecy. The Gospels say that. So there's a connection there. He likely was an Essene if the Essenes thought that they were going to fulfill that, and John fulfilled it. Another weird one, and I like this one because it's something that everybody knows and most people don't really know why. It's just it's an odd detail that the Gospels give us. Why do they tell us that John had a diet of locusts. I mean,
and wore a hair shirt, right?
Right. It just casually mentions it and then doesn't explain it. But of course, at the time, the writer is expecting the reader to understand this stuff because it was, back then, it was 2,000 years ago. We're a little bit more separated in our time and location. But John had a diet of locusts. As I show in the book, locusts were not a common food in Israel at the time, except in Qumran. And actually, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we actually find instructions on how to prepare locusts for food. So it was actually a delicacy in Qumran. It's in their community rule or Damascus document. I read those back to back, so I get them mixed up. But it's somewhere in there. I quoted in the book. So I think that's why that detail is there. And then
people at that time, 2,000 years ago, just seeing that somebody's eating locusts, there was a significant amount of that population who would have gone, okay, that guy's in the scene.
Yeah, yeah. It was something that pretty much only they were kind of known for that. I mean, I'm sure other people, if they wanted to, they could have eaten them, but like a Chinese restaurant's going to be known for Kung Pao chicken or something. You're not going to go to an Italian place. It's like, okay, that's Chinese. So I think it was like if somebody sees somebody eating a locust, that's probably in a scene.
Right. It makes sense.
One of the more interesting ones too. John's father worked in the temple, but for some reason we don't see John following that tradition. So the Essenes were actually known for accepting other people's children into their community and being raised by them as their own, kind of like an apprenticeship, but they were part of the community. So what probably happened is, so his dad is working in the temple, so he's not in a scene. And then this angel shows up. He learns about John. He can't talk for a while, so he knows it's real. Well, at that time, he's got to realize, oh my gosh, the Essenes had it right. I'm in the wrong place. And so when John is born, that's why John wasn't raised in the temple with the corruption and everything. That's probably why he was shipped off to Qumran, and they raised him in Qumran. So there's also a church father as well that lists John as being the leader of the school of the prophets that apparently was still active at that time in Qumran. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are full of prophecies and stuff too. So there's a bunch of stuff about that.
Wow, it's amazing. It's really amazing. And I think you quote in your book, like Qumran is the home of the prophets of Israel and the descendants of a long line of men from the Melchizedek order. So
absolutely.
Really something else.
Yeah, and then the last one, John was baptizing before Jesus comes on the scene. The Essenes were known for frequent ritual bathings. I mean, the Pharisees sort of had that too, but with the Essenes, it was like all the time. They would do it before meals. Like it was a big part of their community, and it was like an initiation thing. It was like this is how to initiate you into the community. Well, when Jesus comes on the scene, Jesus gets baptized, but now it's not just being baptized into the Essene community. Now it's like, if you're going to follow Jesus, you be baptized in his name. And so it's still that initiation thing. It's like the initiation into Christianity. It doesn't provide salvation. Salvation is through Jesus Christ alone, but it's like the initiation. It's like the stamp on it. It's like, now you have dedicated yourself. You want to do this, and you're showing everybody else. So they had that same kind of thing in Qumran with the Essenes. They were really big into oaths. They were really careful about how they did oaths and stuff like that. So if they're initiating somebody in, it's like a big deal. So that's why baptism was such a big focus of John's ministry.
Fascinating. It's really something else. And the Qumran is really not far from the alleged site where Christ was baptized, right?
Right.
So it's like a stone's throw. It's probably a short walk, like a mile or two, I think. Or
yeah,
maybe
if I remember right, it's only a couple miles, or it's within walking distance. Yeah.
And so you see that similarity. It's really, So, and I think it proves your point in your book. You say that the Dead Sea Scrolls provide additional biblical insight. And I think that's really something that bears out with all of this library of files that was found.
Yeah. And that's actually, you bring up a good point. That's one of the most important things about this is that the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's lost Jewish history. And right now, most Jewish people, they're either secular or Orthodox, which comes from Pharisee teaching, and they don't know that there's this other option. They've heard of Christians, these crazy Christians over here, but Jewish Orthodox Jews and secular Jews don't really care much for Christianity generally, and it's going to be hard if you use the word Christian. They're going to have something in their mind on what that is, and it's going to be harder to. But they don't know that there's this other option here, where there's an extremely rich history that's full of honor and obedience to God, that is completely Jewish. And unfortunately, most Jewish people today don't have access to that part of their history. So I would think if we can help Jewish people reclaim their history, show them like, all right, forget about the Christians. Look at the Essenes. Look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is actual Jewish history. They were honorable. They didn't corrupt the temple. They actually left because of corruption. This is extremely Jewish stuff. If we can get them interested in that and they read this stuff, you're going to see Messiah, you're going to see Jesus all over the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can let the Dead Sea Scrolls speak for themselves. So if we can help the Jewish people reclaim their history, I think they'll be more likely to consider Jesus, because the Essenes immediately knew who Jesus was when he came, and they accepted him. That's why in the Gospels you have some people where it takes very little convincing. Basically, they see Jesus and thousands, convert. But then other times he gets around some other people, usually the Pharisees and Sadducees, and it's like, no, you talk to them for days and days and they're not budging. Right. But that's why the ones that were accepting of Jesus immediately, it's because they were already expecting that. They were seeing their prophecies in the Dead Sea Scrolls, their own prophecies getting fulfilled. And they were seeing Jesus do all that. So they expected that. That's why it was easier for them to convert. But the really cool thing is, I know we don't have an unlimited amount of time, so I want to make sure I at least close this thread. But the Essenes, the reason they disappeared, academia acts like it's a mystery. Nobody knows. Maybe it has something to do with the destruction of the temple. Maybe they fled. That's not what it was. They became Christians, and they took the Great Commission seriously, and they went out and preached the gospel to the world. Like, we come from the Essenes, we Christians. Wow. And it's because of them that we have this amazing Christian tradition that we have now, where we still do the same thing. We go out through the world and we try to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ to anybody who will hear and accept it. So that's how amazing the Essenes are, and how amazing this history is that we're commonly not taught in church, because a lot of this is only just now coming to light.
Right. I mean, it's all very recent type stuff, and people are still interpreting it. And you go through some of the documents. You talk about the War Scroll, the Melchizedek document, the Aramaic Apocalypse. Can you talk about the importance or relevance of some of these uncovered manuscripts?
Yeah. So what's really cool about them is the mystery that's involved. So like the War Scroll, I wrote, just to take that one as an example, I wrote about it extensively in the book, but to be honest, I don't know what to do with it. It seems like it talks about the way most people interpret it, or if you watch the History Channel, they'll say the War Scroll is about this end time battle against the sons of darkness and the sons of light, and it is that. But when you actually read through it, it seems like it's more than one battle. It seems like it's describing more than one thing for more than one purpose. And so in the book, and nobody really knows, but in the book, I kind of go through some options. Maybe it's multiple prophetic wars, because angels are fighting in some of these wars too. So, but then it'll give odd time frames. Like it's not a 7-year war, or it's not like what you would expect Armageddon. It's something like 29 years or like 35 years. It gives these weird times. So with that, it is something end times, but the way it's described, it goes into great detail about like the trumpets of war that people are blowing, and talks about a lot of stuff like that. One thing that's really interesting, and this is a common thread through some of the other prophetic Dead Sea Scrolls, is it talks about this group of people called famous men. Now that's just how it's translated. I don't know what the original Hebrew is, but it's translated as famous men. And if this is an end times battle, and it must be because the Messiah is there, angels are there, when you look at all the people groups, you have everybody except glorified human beings. I think that's what the famous men are. And because when you read the description, it kind of sounds like glorified human beings, and who have been restored physically. So with the War Scroll, I don't know. Another scroll like that is the Temple Scroll, which is something that I've been looking into recently and trying to understand. But that's another one where it's clearly really important, because they saved it. The Temple Scroll is one of the longest scrolls that remains preserved, but a lot of it has degraded. Unfortunately, the top third of it is gone. There's lines missing in between parts. So the temple scroll first talks about a lot of sacrifices and kind of normal temple things, but then it gets into this description of what sounds like the millennial temple described in Ezekiel. But when you read it, it's different. There's different elements, and they don't match. So I don't know what the purpose of that was, what it was supposed to be. There, I like the mystery of it because nobody really knows. So I'm currently involved in that. And then so there's some mysterious stuff like that, but even when we don't know exactly what it is, it's still important. It still points back to the Essenes, their history in the land there. And one of the biggest things that the Jews actually have the right to the land there. So and that helps prove it. But very important documents. I'm waiting to see what some of these other ones like the War Scroll and Temple Scroll actually mean.
Gotcha. And I think one of the interesting aspects of your book and kind of the title of your book is also timing and how you set around kind of the histories, the 700-year histories, because I think it plays into our current age. Can you talk about how that our current age is based or can be expanded upon by the Essene knowledge?
Definitely. So right off the top, I'll say I am not saying that the end of the world or the rapture or the return of Christ or anything like that is coming in 2025. That's not what I'm saying. The subtitle is 2025 and the Final Age of Man. And the reason that it's titled like that is the Essenes had this view of human history, all of human history from the beginning of the creation of Adam up until the new heavens and new earth. They saw that time period as being 7,000 years split up into ages. And it's kind of modeled after just the calendar week. So every day would be 1,000 years. Doesn't that sound familiar? So, and actually, I think that's why we get stuff like that in the New Testament. I think some of the New Testament writers were influenced. I mean, some of them were Essenes themselves, and some of them were influenced later by Essene writings. But that's why we have that. There was this view. So every age is 2,000 years, and they saw 4 ages. The last age would be a half, like a millennial, like Sabbath, 1,000-year Sabbath rest. But they saw all of it as like the calendar week. It's just every day is 1,000 years. So the first age was from the creation of Adam to the call of Abraham, and that's called the age of creation. The next one is from the call of Abraham to the to 75 AD, to actually the Council of Yavne, but 75 AD, and that's another 2,000-year period. That they called that the age of Torah, and our age from 75 AD to 2075 AD, they actually called the age of grace. Like the Essenes actually knew enough about it to call it that. Now they didn't have it all put together, otherwise that would violate Ephesians 3. There was still a lot about God's plan here that they didn't know, but they knew that there would be this something about grace, something about God's grace is coming. And so they called our age the age of grace. And if their calendar is correct, their entire calendar has been reconstructed, and it's from the original source material, so we don't have any weird mistranslation of numbers or anything like with the Ethiopian. But the entire calendar has been the yearly calendar. They also had their own yearly calendar, but that's been reconstructed. If we're understanding everything right, and if the Essenes were right, they believed that the end of the age of grace would come in 2075, and they saw that as basically when the Messiah returns. We would say, maybe the end of the tribulation or something, but that's how they saw it, and that would initiate the last 1,000 years. So that, according to the Essenes, again, if all of this is right, they would put the end of our age in 2075. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to wait that long for things to happen, because if you think about the age of Torah, when Jesus came on the scene the first time, it was relatively early in what's called the final Jubilee. So the final 50 years, that would have been from 25 AD to 75 AD. But when you think about it, Jesus came early in that time period, really early. And everything that happened was done, Pentecost and all of that was done by 32 AD. So that was only 7 years after the beginning of the final Jubilee of their age. Well, according to the Essenes, the final Jubilee of our age begins in 2025. And then that would be the last Jubilee where we should start to see prophetic things start to get fulfilled if, again, if the Essene interpretation is correct. And I personally believe there's good reason to suspect that it would be correct because all their other prophecies so far have turned out to be true. So that I think we're entering in very exciting times. So if people are thinking like, oh, we got to wait till 2075. Well, maybe not. There's still a lot of other things that need to happen. If people, for those who believe in the 7-year tribulation thing, that could come early. And because think about this, when Jesus comes back, I don't believe he's just going to clap his hands and automatically the world's different, right? He doesn't seem to operate that way. I think what's going to happen is it's going to take time for the world, whoever's left, the world to learn the new rules. How are things going to work in the millennium? I think that's going to take time. How long does it take for the nations to, beat their swords into plowshares? I don't think all that's going to happen overnight. I don't know how long it's going to be, but I could see that taking maybe even a few years. Who knows? So all we know is the millennium itself is 1,000 years, and in between these ages, there seems to be this transition period of a jubilee, and it seems to happen in the final jubilee of the previous age before the next age to come. If that pattern, because in the age of creation you have the Tower of Babel incident right before the end of that age, and then right before the end of the age of Torah you have everything with Jesus, and then you have the destruction of the temple. And so what we might have is in 2025, somewhere in that final jubilee, we might have the rest of the prophecies being fulfilled the way they're going to be filled. I don't know for sure, and like I say in the book, don't run up your credit cards. Don't sell your house. I actually say in the book, if I really was going to predict anything, the safe bet would be to say 2025 is going to come and go, and nothing's going to happen, and everything's going to be just as awful as it always was.
But I mean, do you find any of the Essenes had eschatology that was anything distinctly different than the common biblical corpus? Did you find any variants? Okay, so
no, and that's the amazing thing. It actually all lines up really well. And in the very end of the book, and I'll leave that for people to go and read on their own. I won't get really into it, but at the very end of the book, I actually show how the Dead Sea Scrolls are perfectly compatible with Bible prophecy. They don't change anything. They add some context. They help connect some dots, but everything's the same. The only thing I can't figure out again is that description in the temple scroll of this temple that never was built. And it sounds like by the description that it's the millennial temple, but it's totally different. However, I would not say that is like a wrong prophecy. I just don't think that's the Ezekiel prophecy. I don't know what it is because we don't have the context. We have no idea why that was written or what the message is supposed to be for it. So that would be the only thing where it's like, I don't have enough information to really judge that one, the temple scroll. But that is the closest so far that I've ever come up against like a contradiction or something that was just totally different. But again, temple scroll might not have anything to do with the millennial temple, might not have anything to do with Revelation or Ezekiel's vision. It could be something totally different. So that one I put in that category. But yeah, the rest of them, I mean, it goes along with it really, really well. It seems like Essene eschatology and Christian eschatology are pretty much identical.
Wow, amazing. Well, that's a great talk, Josh. Thanks for sharing all that information. Yeah. Where's the best place to get the book?
skywatchtv.com, because if people get it there, they'll get some extra materials. They'll get Ken Johnson's new book, which we released together. Ken actually wrote the foreword to my book, and I was honored to write the foreword to his. So it was really cool. And then it comes with some other materials as well that people can check out at skywatchtvstore.com. Or if people just want the book, they can get it on Amazon. Wherever they get the book, though, I would ask people to please leave me a review, because that does help. But yeah, skywatchtvstore.com is the best place to go.
Gotcha. I will put that in the show notes, skywatchtvstore.com. And then for people who want to listen to your podcast, it's The Daily Renegade. And then your podcast is Inside the Daily Renegade. right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so Daily Renegade is basically a collection of different shows. We have about 5 or 6, and I host 2 of them, The Sharpening Report and JPD Weekly. One of them's like an interview show. The other one's kind of more of a Bible study show. I kind of took a hiatus to get through the holidays, but getting ready to start producing some more content again soon. So yeah, dailyrenegade.com. People can check that out, and they can check out some of the other hosts we have. We have Gary Wayne, Brian Melvin, and so people will be able to find something there that they like. Dailyrenegade.com.
I heard your interview with Michaela Peterson. That was really fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
That one, so that was cool.
Yeah.
And thanks so much for your time, Josh. Again, the title of the book is The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, 2025 in the Final Age of Man. Really superbly well researched. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. It was great talking to you again.
All right, awesome. God bless. All right, stay there.